place where they told you what to chase, told you how to run the race. Every move was on the page, but I didn't like their way. Had to fight and misbehave, had to find a way to change, had to leave to find my way.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome to Gamble, the high-stakes game of life. My name is TJ Lasig, back in the host chair for this episode. And Coop, we got one of the most exciting sports times of the year because this Thursday, the madness begins. March Madness basketball tournament, going to be taking our TVs by storm. And always, like I said, one of the more active sports weekends in general. At least for like the first 2 days, it captures everyone's attention, whether you're a big sports fan or not. So, Coop, you ready for the madness to begin?
I can't imagine much work is going to get done on Thursday and Friday this week, with games starting at 11:30 a.m. on the East Coast and going all the way to basically midnight. But yeah, March, the air is changing, the weather is getting nice. NCAA March Madness is here, and the spring is around the corner. So I really feel like it's that time, at least on the East Coast, where you start to feel like things are changing. There's just a different energy in the air, and March Madness typically is the beginning of all of that goodness that is ahead of us. So really excited to chop it up on March Madness, and a really interesting mathematical theory that we'll dive into here.
March is a great time of year. We talked golf on the last episode. I feel like March Madness leads us right into the Masters, and then we're off and running. But yeah, as Coop alluded to here, we're going to talk through all things March Madness on this episode. But Coop and I are not ball knowers by any means. We are not expert college basketball people, but rather we're going to kind of look through the lens of this idea of game theory and how game theory can be applied to March Madness bracket specifically. I actually think it's one of the most easy to understand, if you can call it easy, concepts of game theory being applied. I feel like, game theory in general is kind of a buzzword in a lot of these types of game formats. So let's dive on in. Yeah. All right. I want to start. Well, Coop, what do you think or know about game theory before I got the Google definition here that I'm going to read, but what comes to mind when you hear game theory with regards to these types of things?
Yeah, I never had thought all that much about game theory until fantasy sports. And that was my first sort of deep dive into what it really is. And I think you can really make it quite complicated because it's not simple math. It's not a simple calculation. I think it really comes to life in some of the peer-to-peer. We talk a lot about peer-to-peer gambling type games, things like poker, fantasy sports. March Madness brackets fit really well in that category. But really, it's about doing what is best. How I would describe it, after listening to a ton of different YouTube videos and things like that, is I would say it's about making the choice that is best for you to get to the best outcome, knowing you're making choices against another opponent or counter opponent. So there's, a set of choices that are out there. You can make any choice that you want, but really the choice that you make depends on the choices that other people are making as well. And that's why it comes to life a lot in the conversations around peer-to-peer, these peer-to-peer type games that we talk about a lot about. So yeah, putting yourself in the best position to make the best choice and get the most information out of the opponents you're playing against.
If you Google game theory, here's the definition. It's a branch of mathematics concerned with the analysis of strategies for dealing with competitive situations where the outcome of participants' choice of action depends critically on the action of other participants. Game theory has been applied to contexts in war, business, and biology. So yeah, pretty much as Coop was describing, it's this idea that you are making a decision, but you are aware of the fact that other people within the quote unquote game are making decisions too. Now let's start with as simple of an example as you get. I think three to me formats that are most applicable or easy to understand for game theory: March Madness, as we're talking about today. NFL Survivor pools, I think, is maybe the most simple of them. And then the one that gets talked about frequently and is the most complex of them all is daily fantasy sports, as we've talked about previously, DFS. And game theory really comes into play with the idea of ownership and how much someone is going to be owned or not. But to start with, I think the most basic example here. So let's think about March Madness, right? Say you're in a pool, there's 100 total people, you and 99 others. And in this exercise, you know that the final is going to be Duke versus Auburn. And you know that all 99 other people are going to pick Duke as the winner, right? In that scenario, even if you thought Duke was going to win, Duke was more likely to beat Auburn. Even if you thought Duke was 70 or 80% to beat Auburn, game theory wise, you would 100% of the time select, or sorry, if you thought it was going to be Duke, you would select Auburn to win because everyone else is going the opposite direction. So it kind of is that what do you win when you win sort of mentality where you want to find the break even point between the likelihood of a certain outcome happening and how the field or the people that you're playing against are reacting to that. A similar example would also be in an NFL survivor pool. Same type of thing. If there was a week where it's you and 99 other people and the Kansas City Chiefs are 17-point favorites, by far the best pick on the board. If you knew that all 99 other people were picking the Chiefs in Survivor that week, you would pick another team because on the off chance, even though it's unlikely, when the Chiefs do lose, you get all the upside and win by default. How do you feel about those two examples as a way to most simply, obviously very extreme examples, but I think that kind of puts the concept on the table to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I think it's the best like way to think about game theory. And I think so many people are using game theory or at least applying concepts of game theory without even potentially knowing it. I think when you describe those situations, it is just simply common sense to go the other way in both of those scenarios. And obviously we're oversimplifying them to kind of put out a scenario that makes the most sense. But the whole concept of filling out your bracket and making these picks, you're in these pools with 25, 50, 100, sometimes thousands of entrants. So really you're trying to give yourself the best chance to rise to the top 1% where the money is all at the top. So you're trying to find what are the best selections. And I think it really is a massive game of game theory and hiding amongst the sporting event where the outcome is a lot of the times a coin flip. In many of these situations, you're going to see winning percentages, obviously in the 1 versus the 16 seeds, it's probably in the 80 or 90% range that the 1 seed wins, but the outcome is still, very much there's a chance that an upset happens a lot of the time in these kind of tournaments.
March Madness is for sure an interesting one. It's it's obviously impossible to predict what all of your opponents are going to do, but you can get kind of close enough. And I think one of the mistakes, if you will, that people make in March Madness specifically is actually taking this kind of thing too far. And every, quote unquote, sharp person that I listen to about March Madness, pretty much the main talking point is always that you don't need to get as crazy off the board as you think you do. Even when you zoom out and look at how March Madness brackets ends up, most of the time, the Final Four, the Elite Eight, is made up of the 1s and 2 seeds. Yes, is there these Cinderella stories that happen? Of course, sometimes, but between the likelihood of a Cinderella story happening to begin with, and then B, choosing who it's going to be, it's just very, very difficult to do. And a lot of being good at putting together brackets is keeping things simple for the most part, finding small places to differentiate, but you don't need to be the hero and try to find the 7 seed that's going to go to the final 4 or the 12 seed that's going to go to the elite 8. You can mostly pick the best teams and find other smaller ways to get different and, find parts within each quadrant to kind of differentiate. So I feel like that's the main thing that I see from a high level March Madness strategy. And specifically looking at round one, I think we can find some game theory slash math type of examples. And to specifically talk about this year's bracket, I noticed 2 games in particular. So let's look at it's Colorado State as a 12 seed versus Memphis as a 5 seed. But Colorado State, the 12 seed, if you look at the Vegas lines, is actually a 2.5 point favorite. Most people probably aren't even going the second level of looking at the Vegas lines for the first one. They're just going to assume that a 5 seed is way better than a 12 seed because it looks like that on paper. And when I went on the Yahoo site, it says that 69% of users are picking Memphis to win. So to me, that's a classic. Now, the game is a total coin flip. It's 2.5 points. Whoever's going to win. But say it is a total 50-50. You have the opportunity to pick the team that 70% of people are picking or to pick the team that 30% of people are picking. That's where the game theory element comes into play. And so the sharp mathematical pick in that sense is to take Colorado State because you're not only getting the team that's actually more likely to win the game, but you're getting them at less ownership than the team that's least likely to win the game. So to me, that was the specific example in this year's bracket that best highlights game theory and how you can use it and how you can apply that thinking to lots of different things outside of just March Madness.
Yeah, you said something there too that I think comes up in these conversations and comes up a lot in daily fantasy sports. You said get different. I want to dig a little bit more into that. In order to win an event like a March Madness pool, you want to not have the same bracket as somebody, and most likely your first round picks, some of your first round picks will matter a great deal when it comes down to who you have left in the final 4 if you're in the running to win it, because there will be a lot of overlap in. Now, this depends on the number of entrants that are in your poll, but there will be a lot of overlap in terms of who plays in the final 4, who plays in the championship game, and then ultimately who wins who takes down the tournament. But I do think it highlights that in order to get different, you can make a simple play like this, and then your bracket is different than say 60 to 70% of brackets that are out there. There's so much content out there these days. I've already saw on Twitter so many people referencing this Colorado State game in Memphis. So the sharps are going to kind of be all over it. But I do think, getting different doesn't mean going crazy off the board, which is how a lot of people think, oh, well, my bracket is instantly going to be different. You want to get different, but you don't want to basically throw your bracket away by just picking too many of these upsets that happen, which I think is, the pendulum there can swing from just picking all favorites to picking too many of these teams that are unlikely to win games.
100%. And it depends on how you want to balance your overall bracket too. If you have so just looking at the likelihood of everyone winning, the top 4 teams, the 1 seeds, if you look at the Vegas odds, are far and away the most likely to win. Duke plus 320, Florida plus 380, Auburn plus 400, Houston plus 600. And then after that, the next closest teams are plus 2200. So those top 4 are far and away the most likely to win, and then also the most likely to be picked by other people. So, for example, if you feel strongly about a 2 or 3 seed that you want to pick as your champion, just doing that alone is going to make you different enough that everywhere else you should kind of just pick the favorites. Because if that team wins, you're in a great, if like what's I don't even know, Tennessee, but Tennessee would probably be picked. I don't have good examples. Iowa State, I don't know, a random 3 seed that I just looked at on my bracket. You feel strongly about Iowa State for whatever reason. You think they're going to win it all. Just by doing that, you don't need to also have the 7th seed that goes to the Final Four or whatever crazy thing, because Iowa State's either going to win it all or not, and you're either going to win your bracket or not based on that. So don't put yourself in a situation where Iowa State does win, but you also shot yourself in the foot 4 other places in your bracket, and now you don't even cash in because of it.
Yeah, that's such a
that's
good way to think about it too, in terms of like being different. You might be different with your champion or with a game in the Elite Eight or the Final Four that differentiates you from a lot of people. So I think that is a good way to think about filling out your bracket holistically. If you want to kind of take the route of the chalk and pick a team like Florida or Duke to win it all, then you might have to get different in other spots earlier, versus if you've got a team like even Houston. I was looking at Houston, and their odds dictate this in some way. They're, like you said, plus 600, but I saw on ESPN that only 8% of brackets are taking Houston to win it all. So you're already relatively different compared to the 40 to 50% that are picking Florida or Duke if you're picking Houston. So you probably want to stay pretty consistent with like what Vegas odds and the lines of the games indicate you probably the side that you should take. And I think there's a lot of data points here in analyzing how to fill out your bracket. But I would agree with you that 60% of people probably aren't even looking at the Vegas lines for the game. So if you're looking at a game that is a 6-point favorite, it really begs the question of where do you want to pick your upsets? How are you selecting and how are you looking at data to pick your upsets? Obviously, it's fun to pick upsets and then be right, but that doesn't really win you the overall tournament or the overall bracket pool that you're in. Really, it matters of keeping your best picks in the game as long as you can.
Another thing that becomes relevant here in March Madness and in all of these game types when you're looking at a game theory scenario is how many people you're playing against. If you're doing a bracket pool with 15 of your buddies, 20 of your buddies, that's a very small group. So you can get away with getting even less different. There's going to be even more, people picking the same routes. You don't need to hit the absolute nut scenario in order to win. If you're in a pool with 500 people, 1,000 people, if you're trying to, enter the ESPN thing with 100,000 people, then it's a totally different ball game. So that also has an impact. You see this in fantasy sports too, how you approach a tournament with 100 people versus 1,000 versus 10,000 versus 100,000. Very different cases in terms of the game theory and the outcome that you're trying to solve for. And especially, I feel like most of us are probably in these friends, office pools, whatever, in the 20 to 30, 50 people max range. You don't need to get every game right. You really don't. If you get the Final Four correct and the champion correct, you're probably in a good chance to win. So I think that's the main thing is don't psych yourself out by thinking you have to get so crazy. And you can find these things like the Colorado State that is not actually crazy. It's actually the more likely scenario, but the people that aren't even looking at that, like you said, anyone that's on Twitter or listening to any podcast, that's going to be the number one thing that gets pointed out. But I really think that many people aren't even going that far. Another thing that you'll hear a lot about in March Madness series is this Ken Palm. I was just looking at it last night. I'm not super, dude. I miss the days when I used to love the 538 bracket. Do they just have that behind a paywall now? That used to be my go-to, but it seems like you can't get any super good stuff without paying for it these days, which I'm not quite willing to do. But 538 used to show you the likelihood of each team getting to a certain spot, and then you could kind of compare it to ESPN and Yahoo's numbers of how many people are picking it. That used to be the perfect example. I don't know if you're aware of any good tools out there that people can get for free, including myself, because I'd like to find something good.
I'm not aware. I do think 538 got purchased. I think Nate had sold it. I can't remember exactly to where, but I'm not sure that the site is even around anymore. But it shows you it was such a good tool to use because it leveraged so much data and analysis and then put it into such a good visual for even the simple-minded people looking at this. It gave you an opportunity to make really, really clean decisions, and have faith in the decisions that you were making. So it's such a good tool to leverage a lot of data analysis that goes on behind the scenes. So I don't know of any resources. I am familiar with KenPom and the name. I'm not like super familiar with like the in-depth analysis that these people do, but I do think getting your fingers on some data related to like things like ESPN has put out, the percentage of people holistically that they're estimating are going to pick a certain champion, that's a good like data point to have when you're picking these games. I think Vegas, the lines of the matchups, and a site like DraftKings maybe even have like some second line matchups that are out there potentially to look at as
Yeah,
well.
and you can look at odds to get to the Sweet 16, for example, on DraftKings, which is good. I just pulled up the KenPom site. Really, the main, even at the most basic level, it just has a ranking of all the teams. And yes, all the number one seeds are at the top, but it goes to show you, like, they have Gonzaga, who's an 8 seed, at number 9, which is interesting. 9 out of all the teams. So just because people's have a certain ranking number on paper isn't necessarily a true reflection of how good of a team they are. It's directionally correct, but you see some outliers in teams that are either kind of overseeded or underseeded relative to Ken Palm says are good. I'm not the guy that's here to tell you which teams are good or not good at basketball. Just trying to look at the numbers and figure out how to play the game theory elements accordingly. But yeah, it all just comes down to that. It comes down to what teams are good, how likely are they to win, and how does that compare to what the public is picking, and where do we find some mismatches there and try to take advantage of them in a smart way.
You mentioned evaluating the poll that you're playing in, and I think that's a really good point in terms of information to take in. Most people don't even look at things like that. So if you're in an office poll and you know half of the people are going to pick games based on the mascots, then using game theory is very sharp because people aren't going to just pick the best teams, and you can just pick the best teams and differentiate yourself. Of course, you'll be upset whenever the 2 seed loses in the second round, but overall, you're going to set yourself so much further apart than people just picking randomly than anyone else. And that's really what game theory is about. So the more you're able to get familiar with the game that you're playing, the poll that you're playing, I think that gives you an even bigger leg up in terms of how do I apply game theory here versus, game theory. If you're looking at it really broadly, and you're looking at it from the ESPN poll perspective where there's 100,000 entries. So I think that's a really sharp way to think about filling out a bracket pool. Who am I playing against? How many entries are going to be in this roughly? And how different do I need to get? And if you're thinking about that and leveraging just a couple pieces of data like Vegas lines and like the KenPom site, you're well on your way to being differentiated in a really sharp way.
Another good example there is, say you're in a pool with a bunch of people that went to Duke. You know that in any pool, Duke's going to be highly owned, but you're in this pool with where 80% of the people went to Duke. And you're like, you know what? Even if I think Duke is going to win, I know that so many people in this pool are going to pick Duke as their champion. So this is the perfect time to take Florida or Auburn or Houston, because again, even though Duke is the favorite and is the most likely to win, if they get over-owned to even more of an extreme, it's more reason to go the other way. I think that's the best way to think about it. One of my favorite, and with Duke, it's not as good because Duke is a good pick. It's better off, but like we with my buddies, we do an NHL playoff bracket every year, And it's the best when the Flyers make the playoffs because all these idiots pick the Flyers to win the Stanley Cup, even though that's never going to happen. It's like we're in such a homer pool that 40-50% of the people in the pool are picking Flyers, who are like have a 3% chance of winning the Stanley Cup to win. So it's just people lighting dead money on fire. I think the finding those little niches of where you're in a pool with a bunch of homers can sometimes present the best game theory, because that's a whole nother element of people that are just purely picking based on their own rooting interest versus using any kind of strategy.
This episode reminds me a lot of how to be sharp and how to like assess information. When you're filling out these polls, it's so easy to get really narrow focused on an individual 5 versus 12 matchup, or an individual team that you want to pick or take, versus even looking at outside data and information. Who am I playing against? What schools did they go to? Who might be over-owned? You know, in your scenario, I would say a really good way to look at it is if a lot of people are going to pick Duke, you know, you're looking at that side or that quadrant of the bracket, then you got Alabama sitting there as a 2 seed who was pretty highly touted all season, who's a pretty big team from everything that I've read. They're on KenPom's rating, they're number 6. So they're just outside the ones. They're the second best number 2 seed. If you just take Alabama, then you're differentiated very, very well there. And you could take a team like Florida, who is probably the second most, the second best odds team to win it all. And you're in a great spot. You don't need to take too many 13 seeds or 12 seeds into the Sweet 16 and things like that. So I think assessing the outside information is such a good way to think about it. And this episode and March Madness specifically presents itself in a way to think about the data that you have available that nobody else is analyzing at all.
And with the example you just gave there, it's also a good example of if you're trying to fade Duke in that sense, you're combating it in 2 different ways there. You're taking Alabama over Duke in one sense, but then there's no need to take Alabama to win it all. You take someone from the other side to win it all, Florida, for example. That way you have 2 outs at it. Alabama can beat Duke, or Florida can beat Duke in the championship, rather than putting all your eggs on like, oh, I have Alabama beating Duke, therefore I also need them to go all the way and win it all. Then you're just kind of doing the same thing of doing too many fancy things at once. Not to say you can't do that. Hey, if you think Alabama, at the end of the day, if you know who's going to win, great. Just pick the teams that are going to win. That's always the square argument to the sharps, is just like, well, but this team is going to win. Okay, well, if you have a crystal ball and you know who's going to win, by all means, just pick them to freaking win. But I enjoy the thought exercise of it all more so than what actually happens, because at the end of the day, March Madness is one of the most random things that could happen, and all of these types of games in one session are nothing but randomness. But there's a lot of, March Madness is fun because you can make it as simple as what mascots do I like, or you can get super in the weeds on all the game theory. And at the end of the day, it's pretty much a coin flip either way. But I do think that a lot of people way overthink themselves and play themselves out of brackets. And just by being pretty chalky for the most part, finding your 1, 2, 3 leverage points is the best way to go about it.
Yeah, there's so many scenarios. I didn't even in the example of Alabama there with Duke, I didn't even really think about that, right? It didn't hit me that like, oh, well, if you take Alabama and you're right, and then Alabama goes on to win, like, oh, that's great. They beat a Duke team. They can win. They could, but in order to sort of play the best play in that bracket, it really is giving yourself 2 chances. It really is kind of going with a bit more of a chalky outcome in Florida, knowing that, okay, well, if I could just take Alabama one step further, like you're in a great spot differentiated there, and you're picking Florida that a lot of other people had, but you're having Alabama over an outcome that nobody probably had, or not many people had. So I really think, it goes to show you how, 64 teams and all of these decisions that are they get exponentially more important as you go on, and one decision affects the other. So I think that really showcases that. So, that was something I didn't even think about. So that was such a well-crafted commentary there from you.
It really is putting together a bit of a puzzle, thinking about each quadrant of the bracket, thinking about what other people are going to do. It's a fun exercise. And then, hey, you turn on the game and before you know it, a 15 seed beats the 2 seed and you're like, okay, well, onwards we go. Any other final thoughts on March Madness that you have, Coop?
Yeah, one thing that I like to do is put together my bracket, and then I typically will go back through and just see, okay, how many upsets did I pick? Because I do think what permeates your brain for March Madness and what is popular to be talked about are these upsets. And make no mistake about it, it's awesome when you pick a 12 over a 5 or a 13 seed to win and they go and win. You're super thrilled about it, you're pumped about it, and your brain kind of wants that to happen. But if you have 10 upsets in a pool of 50 people, it's probably just too many upsets. You've probably just swung the pendulum a little bit too far. And yeah, you get 1 or 2 of those upsets right, but you have 8 other ones that you're staring down the barrel of that almost everybody else, 60 to 70% other people pick the sharp side or the side that's supposed to win, and you're playing catch up then the rest of the rounds. So I typically do at least like to go back through and get confident that I don't have too many upsets in play for the number of entrants that are in these polls. That's probably the last thing that I do as someone who, like you said, doesn't really know college basketball. I'm usually like watching it. This year I've watched less and less college basketball, and I've found myself more gravitated towards watching the NBA in basketball season. I tend to watch the NBA a little bit more than I used to versus college. But yeah, it's always the most fun. So I'll be dialed into the games.
I think that's a good rule of thumb right there. So yeah, as we're thinking about our March Madness brackets, I'd say keep it simple. You don't need to go too crazy off the board. Find your 2 or 3 spots where you want to be different, whether that's with your champion or with some early upsets, or maybe one team that you think is going to go deep into the Elite 8 as a lower ranked team, and give it a once over when you go back. Make sure that you're not going too crazy on too many upsets across the board, and like Coop said, making it so that you get your 2 right, but then you have eight mistakes in the process and end up just shooting yourself in the foot. I think that's a pretty good way to think about it, and I feel like game theory will be something that comes up again on a future episode. Definitely whenever we get closer to football season. I think Survivor Pool is an even easier example of game theory than March Madness is. And then tournament DFS is the most complex example. And there's other ones too, but to me, those are the 3 that I find to be talked about often and good examples of how we can apply the old theory in real life.
Yeah, I would say if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it really is a pretty interesting concept. The prisoner's dilemma is such a good problem where game theory gets applied. There's some great YouTube videos out there about, playing it or cooperating versus defecting. And then where you get to think about what cooperation is in terms of sports versus defecting when you're playing against somebody else, and how cooperation is really the favorite, defecting is really the least likely outcome. And if both people continue to cooperate, which is picking the favorites, you're more likely to succeed. So it's like, how and when do I defect in order to differentiate myself? So it's a really interesting theory, and sports and these kind of games is such a good example to deploy it, or at least think about it if you're someone who likes to get into the weeds of these games and figure out how and why there are people that continuously make sharp decisions.
Love a good prisoner's dilemma. That's the true example of game theory. So if you aren't familiar with prisoner's dilemma, you can go ahead and Google that. I also love how the Survivor is one of my favorite shows, and Survivor will kind of low key implement some little games where it's prisoner's dilemma. Or one time they implemented a game that was the Monty Hall problem. And then I'll be sitting on the couch and I'll be like, oh, this is the Monty Hall problem. And Christina's like, what are you talking about it? And then I explain it. She's like, I don't get it. Monty Hall problem is one of the most confusing. Maybe we'll do an episode on all the, the old tried and true prisoner's dilemma, Monty Hall problem, whatever else is out there. Because there's understanding those concepts is how you can apply them to all these games, but it can be confusing.
No doubt. No doubt. Last comments from me is just go enjoy it. March Madness is one of the most fun sports times. It's crazy, and like we said, kicks off the spring. So nothing better than having on the games in the background Thursday and Friday, looking at your brackets. And good luck out there. Keep your brackets alive through the first weekend. That's always the goal, and take down some tournaments.
Yeah, here's to not being dead by Friday afternoon. Hopefully, at least enough to get a sweat through the weekend. I feel like is a win in my book. All right. Enjoy the games. Good luck in your brackets. Have fun making those game theory decisions. And stay gambling.
Caught up in a daydream, I beat my mind up there almost daily. It's how I pass time, no opinions safely. It's how I understand what I want in this place, see. Cause everybody wanna tell you bad things. What could go wrong, what fame brings, but success is a finicky thing. And if you ain't sure, no, it'll never be.